And welcome everyone to this month's edition of Coffee and Compliance, the March edition. This is your host, Jamie Leupold, Director of Channels and Alliances here at PreVeil. I'm a CCP, and I'm excited to have joining me this month, Hayden Freese from the good folks at Sentar. Sentar is an authorized C3PAO based in Huntsville, Alabama. And we've done a lot of work with their team. So very excited to have Hayden. Hayden is a CCA, and she also works on their FedRAMP practice as well as their CMMC practice. Hayden, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Jamie. As Jamie said, I'm recently a CCA. I work with Sentar's CRCS program. So we basically do CMMC gap assessments. We assist our clients in reaching CMMC readiness. We also have recently started doing the CMMC joint surveillance assessments as well. And in addition to that, I also do FedRAMP, and I'm our FedRAMP program manager.
Fantastic. Thanks, Hayden. I know we've had at least one joint customer go through JSVA, so that is great. And I'm sure we're excited to have many, many more go through. So as always, the Coffee and Compliance series is designed to answer your compliance questions, anything related to CMMC, NIST, DFARS, ITAR. If you can throw an acronym at it, we're happy to answer them. And then, the theme for this month is going to be on scoping, a really critical exercise that not a lot of people maybe fully understand how to do well. And if you're not doing scoping well, that can lead to some unintended consequences as you're going through your assessment. It can increase costs, it can increase complexity, things that, are going to make your life, a little bit more challenging as far as compliance goes. So that's the theme. We've got a few things to cover around scoping, but again, use that Q&A function to ask whatever questions you have. We'll get to as many, questions as we can. We did have some that were sent in prior that we'll certainly be getting to. And otherwise, we'll just go ahead and get started and kind of talk a little bit more about scoping. So I guess just to start, what is scoping? It's really, how you're setting your security boundary. And that's the boundary that you're going to be, storing, processing, and transmitting CUI in, CUI in, as well as, the potential security protection assets that are going to be protecting your CUI boundary. Hayden, I know you've worked on many assessments. What are some of the things that you try to help customers focus on when they are creating that security boundary, when they are creating their scoping boundary?
So, Jamie, to answer that, we typically focus on, well, the intent of the scoping boundary is to map out the client's CUI flow. It's important to map out the point of entry for CUI. A lot of customers tend to overlook that. So if that's email, it likely is, that point of entry also needs to be within the scope. But it's really just to ensure that the client themselves also has a well-rounded understanding of where their CUI is in their environment. That's the first step. And I think to achieve that, organizational leaders, CISOs, IT managers need to engage cross-company to ensure that they have a full understanding of how CUI is being accessed on their environment and how it is being utilized, stored, processed, and transmitted. And then from there, they can map out their scoping boundary accordingly. I hope that answered the question.
Great. Yeah. And, this question does come up a lot for me as well when I'm talking to our customers with their compliance challenges. One of the things that I always like to discuss with them and want to get your thoughts on this as well is thinking outside of just your technical assets. So everybody thinks about my endpoints, my servers, if I have any, all of the technical digital assets, but they forget about their actual physical offices. They forget about the people, right? People are part of your scope, the people that are accessing CUI. If you have printers, if you have file cabinets that you're going to be storing hard CUI in, are these all things that you're advising your clients to pay attention to as well? And I think that certainly maps, with the data flow diagrams that you talked about, but just making sure that it's not just digital for those organizations that are not, purely digital these days.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Jamie. So yeah, we tend to see, to reiterate what you said, that a lot of clients tend to focus on that digital aspect, and but it is important to remember that CUI does include those physical assets, that hard copy CUI, those USBs, those hard drives that you're storing CUI on as well. Yeah.
Right. Uh, and of course, we find that a lot of our customers are looking to reduce costs these days, and try to keep their assessment costs down as much as possible. And certainly scoping is a critical way to help them achieve that. What are some of the ways that you've seen folks kind of use proper scoping to reduce costs? Um, are you seeing like larger organizations maybe carve out a smaller enclave so that they don't have to go and have everyone in their assessment boundary, and maybe just have the folks that are really the ones that are storing, processing CUI, make those their kind of their own security boundary versus trying to wrap in, unnecessary assets within the organization as a way to reduce the assessment scope?
Yes. You mentioned, well, when my colleagues and I, when we start an assessment, typically we want to know, um, when we look at a boundary diagram, for instance, um, I'm interested in, does this, or are all of your organization's users accessing CUI? And in some cases, that is true, and that means that their scope is very large and includes all of their users, all their endpoints. Um, but Yeah, we've seen, more recently, that some companies, to eliminate that scope, they'll utilize a solution like PreVeil, for instance. They'll only give a certain limited number of users who need to have access to that CUI, to PreVeil or to another solution that they're using to isolate their CUI with. And then you go from having 200 endpoints in scope to, maybe 10. And then I think that eliminates the stress as well, of the people who are going through the assessment. Of course, with the JSV process, and with the CMMC formal rule not being out yet, we don't know what sampling is going to look like. And I think, to minimize the scope as much as possible, by finding ways that you could streamline your organizational processes and just think smarter, rather than working harder, I think benefits the companies, in the long run.
Great. And one of the other things you mentioned early on is having a good data flow diagram to really understand, how CUI is mapped, the CUI is mapped throughout the organization. What are some of the other documents, that we should be looking at to help with scoping? With asset inventory, your SSP, how do those kind of all, help define, what your scope, should look like?
Sure. So, primarily, we are interested in that boundary diagram. We're looking to ensure that the client has the assets correctly marked, in accordance with the CMMC scoping guidance. We're concerned with the SSP, as you mentioned. We're looking for consistencies there. We want to make sure that what you have defined, in your SSP, aligns with what we're seeing on the diagrams, data flow as well. You mentioned an asset inventory, which is good. I would say pretty much, I know we did receive a question on FIPS, which we may get to, but any FIPS keys or FIPS cert numbers, I should say, associated with those assets, we're also concerned with FIPS early on as well.
Good old FIPS. Yeah, we'll get to that. Everyone's favorite topic. Uh, what are kind of some of the mistakes maybe that you've seen folks make when it comes to scoping?
We technically, or well, excuse me, not technically, but we typically see mistakes regarding printing of CUI. We'll start an assessment occasionally, and this is broadly speaking, but if we have to do a physical walkthrough of the office at this point, hypothetically, we've seen the boundary diagram, we know it's in scope. Say we're on site for that physical location that's within scope, and we see a printer, and we'll ask, hey, is CUI authorized to be printed here? If no one knows the answer to those questions, that might cause a little bit of concern for us. Something that we've recognized across the board in assessing organizations through JSV, and also assisting and being on site with our clients who are going through JSV, having an understanding of those organizational processes to include printing of CUI, what your process is, and being able to speak on it confidently will take a customer very, very far. I also know that so for printing CUI, not only is it being printed on site, but what is the company's destruction process? Is there a chain of custody involved? What happens after it's printed? So that would become a CUI flow concern for us, especially if it
Got it.
wasn't marked initially.
Sure. So I think what I'm hearing you say is make sure that your data flow diagrams, your asset inventory, your SSP matches your actual real world usage of CUI. And otherwise, you're inviting, I guess, some scope creep where if you
Yep,
see something that looks like it could be a CUI asset, smells like it could be a CUI asset, you're probably going to then treat it like a CUI asset.
absolutely.
Great. So yeah, I think that that's a great call out, is just because you have everything written down, if you're not then applying that in the real world, somebody is probably going to figure that out for you, and that'll just cause you a lot more unnecessary work than you otherwise if you had, planned things out properly. No, that's great. What other, kind of tips and tricks do you have for folks around scoping that you think, would be helpful to the folks on the call?
I would, to reiterate what I said earlier, make sure that you're aware of your the CUI point of entry in your environment. Make sure that's marked. Um, Also, if you have any subcontractors that are within your environment, say you have someone who has access to a company laptop that occasionally works for your company. Sometimes we see that subcontractors tend to be overlooked. So if you're utilizing a subcontractor, I'm concerned with whether they have access to CUI. So in that that original example that we talked about, the possibility of we go into begin an assessment, and the company has scoped all of their assets, all of their users to have access to that CUI. And if they have subcontractors there and they have the same level of access, I'm worried about them having access to CUI. And to combat that, I would suggest that anyone who is utilizing subcontractors consider the possibility of including them as an extension of their team, ensuring that they are following their company's policies, their procedures, ensuring that you have screening in place. If they are accessing CUI, But subcontractors in particular, if they have access to CUI, then they could, hypothetically, they would be subject to the same controls, right, as the rest of the company would.
Sure. So just kind of treat them as one of your own and make sure that you're including them in all of the same diagrams and
Yes.
your SSP and asset inventory. Now that makes sense. One thing that that comes to mind that we've heard from some of our customers that have gone through the joint surveillance voluntary assessments, including one we just had a webinar with earlier this week, or I guess last week now, one of our customers that went with a different C3PAO, but I heard that in particular, DIBCAC paid close attention to physical security, looking at making sure doors were locked and making sure the
Yes.
server room was very secure. I think that's probably overlooked, when it comes to scoping. I don't know if you've had similar experiences, but I heard some great stories. If you've got anything to share there.
Yeah, I think based on my experience and based on what I know, I'm assuming that is that DIPCAC and that C3PAO um, was acting that way due to the things that we have seen in the past, just because people tend to overlook them. And it's easy, right? I mean, you can have what you consider to be an ironclad process, and I could imagine being in the FSO shoes. They're trying to make sure that their facility is in tip-top shape for a JSV walkthrough, and then some I don't know, some IT engineer has the or even like I want to say not even IT equipment, but just what am I trying to say? Just equipment, things that are related to the power of the building, things that could easily be disrupt organizational operations. And uh, yeah, so we've seen that quite a bit. So I would understand their uh, their level of importance on the physical security.
That's great. Yeah, I know, a lot of our customers obviously focus on digital security, but making sure that, your buildings, if you have buildings, just make sure they're secured and you have policies for visitors, things like that. I think that's often overlooked. And especially when I'm having conversations, with our customers, because they think I've got to secure my laptop, I've got to secure my servers, and that's all well and good, but just pay attention to your environment as well, because that is part of your scope,
Oh yeah.
more often than not.
And it may even it may sound a little silly and arbitrary, but if you had an on-site physical inspection coming up, you could treat it as an exercise. You could have people on site, you could talk through your processes and just make sure that your physical security is ready and follows your established process ahead of that. There's no problem in that.
Great. Um, so I think, that goes through a lot of what we wanted to cover on scoping today. So, again, just to reiterate, scoping is critically important. If you're not scoping properly, you're going to be inviting, assessment creep, and that's going to further delay, make things more complex, potentially raise costs. So if you have a well-defined scope that matches your asset inventory, matches your data flow diagrams, and also matches your real world application of how you're actually handling CUI and CUI in the wild within your organization. That's going to go a long way to really reducing your assessment costs, reducing your assessment effort. And also, you don't then have to go and necessarily have every single endpoint configured and secured the same way as you do your CUI endpoints and your printers and your physical locations. If you have a lot of offices, but you can have one that you can designate that is your CUI office, that'll also make your life, a lot easier versus having to secure an entire building or multiple buildings. Any other last thoughts around scoping before we get into some questions, Hayden?
You mentioned well, so if you had CUI, if we have a boundary where you have multiple physical locations in scope, from a cost perspective, you're already having to potentially pay for a C3PAO and DIBCAC to not only visit at least one location and cover, the travel costs and everything associated with that, but, uh, just to reiterate, keeping the scope as limited as possible is cost effective. And I think to be able to, although limiting your scope, regardless, it seems sometimes as if that takes waves, right, in an organization. But I think if higher level ups, leadership, if they recognize that it is a cost, it could be a detrimental cost, like very significant. I think recognizing the value from a cost perspective is a more effective way for IT managers to bring those issues to leadership to minimize the scope, just to get leadership buy-in, I should say.
Great. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we will open it up to questions now. I see we've had one question come in, and we did have some questions that were asked prior to the live session here. But I think this first one is actually a really good one, very relevant to the topic of scoping. So we can certainly start there. And this question is, how do you verify that assets which outside the scope of the assessment that aren't intended to store, process, transmit CUI actually do not store, process, transmit CUI? And I think there's maybe a couple different ways, we can look at this question, because when we look at the official scoping guidance, of course, there are CUI assets, which we know do store, process, transmit CUI. You have security protection assets, which protect those assets that store, process, transmit CUI. But then we get into some of the more nuanced categories, like a contract or risk managed asset, a CRMA, which can store, process, transmit CUI, but is not supposed to, versus a specialized asset or something that is completely out of scope, which simply cannot store, process, transmit CUI. So Hayden, I'll throw this over to you. Is that something are you verifying that, let's say, a CRMA asset or an out of scope asset isn't storing, processing, transmit CUI? What's that look like during an actual assessment?
Yes, so we are verifying that. So CRMA assets, we are not assessing them against the full 110 controls. Same for specialized and out of scope assets. But if a company has marked it as such, we do verify that it is marked correctly by, so we would look at the CUI data flow. I think to Kyle, to answer your question, I think you would start with that organizational process, ensure that you know exactly where CUI is to the best of your ability. And then you want to ensure that you have effective CUI flow in place. You want to make sure that you have, for endpoints, that you have conditional access policies applied, firewall rules, ACLs. You could utilize network segmentation. You can take this in a really technical route. You can also apply administrative controls to ensure CUI flow, like for printing, for instance. You could have something in your acceptable use policy that prevents you from printing CUI. So we don't necessarily, we're not at this point in JSVs where we don't have the bandwidth to check absolutely everything. But we do verify that the CUI flow is in place as you've defined it as such. So whatever that you have defined preventing CUI from transmitting from one device to another, for instance, we're going to verify that that's in place. I hope that answered your question, Kyle.
So it sounds like the good old trust but verify.
Absolutely.
That a lot of people have moved away from to zero trust, but we'll still trust but verify in some instances. That's great. Let's see, we got a I got muted there for a second. This is also, I think, a good one for you, Hayden, because you did bring this up about, when does the controls and when does your boundary extend to subcontractors versus when would the subcontractor kind of be their own entity and part of their own scope versus your scope? Where do you kind of draw that line?
It regarding a subcontractor, it depends on how they're accessing your environment. So if they're doing it through RDP, for instance, we'd like to know that. Um, we're also concerned with regarding some contractors. I personally would want to know, are they accessing your environment on a corporate owned laptop? Does that laptop have the same conditional access policies applied to it, for instance? That is it under the same restrictions as your company? If it's not, then I would say that would be a red flag because you'd automatically pull it in scope. Um, I'm reading Michael's question. So it says, at what point should the subcontractor be considered their own entity instead of part of our scope? So if the
But
so
that
I'm
become more ownership of the actual equipment, and if they're
yes.
on their network,
Mhm.
I would assume that it's their scope. If they're in
It
your
is.
network working, yeah.
And it's kind of the same way with specialized assets. So if you have GFEs, government
Mhm.
furnished equipment, for instance, um, say that those GFEs are being used to create CUI on behalf of the government, but they're your employees. If um, those GFEs are not considered part of your environment, and they're typically under the process of the prime or of that government entity. So if you have no control over it, then then it would be out of scope. But as far as this may not be super applicable to everyone on this call, but if you have an MSP, say that they're an admin on your environment, for instance, I'm concerned with their level of access, what they have access to, screening requirements, and yeah, it just opens a lot of additional questions. Um, but yeah, Michael, I hope that helped. If you guys have any additional questions that we don't answer on today's call, feel free to email me. Orly and Jamie have my email and they'll share it at the end of this call, but I can always answer additional questions.
Yeah, no, thanks, Aiden. And you actually brought up a great point we didn't cover in scoping, and I think we should have, is ensuring that your external service providers are considered part of your scope, whether that's an MSP or an MSSP or other third-party consultants. Certainly, depending on their level of access to CUI, they can go anywhere from actually being a CUI asset for you, or potentially a security protection asset. So I think that was a great call out, and I'm glad you mentioned that. I know typically government, GFE, government furnished equipment, does fall into the specialized asset category because you can't go and make a lot of changes to
Yep.
GFE to meet their requirements. Um, Another question, a couple more questions that I think are related to scope, and then we'll get into some other questions. Um, can an endpoint be in scope for a transient process example only to process data, does not store or transmit it? Once processing is complete, is it out of scope and doesn't need to continue being monitored, protected, in compliance? Um, that sounds to me like probably not, right? Because if you're storing, processing CUI, even if you're only doing it for a brief moment of time, it still would be a CUI asset.
Agreed.
So yeah, okay. Um, and then is an on-prem SIM, security event information management and monitoring in scope. I think that's pretty straightforward as a security protection asset, correct? That's kind of I think that exact example is listed in the scoping guide, the newly released scoping guide that something like that would be a security protection asset, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I'm in agreement on that. It would be in scope, but it would if a client had marked it as differently, other than a security protection asset, I'd want to know exactly why. I'd want to know that justification. Doesn't mean that it necessarily can't, but that justification would have to be pretty strong.
Sure. And I think maybe where someone is going when they say on-prem is maybe they're confusing the FedRAMP requirements for a cloud service provider versus the requirements for a security protection asset, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud. My understanding is that if it's just a security protection asset, it's still going to be assessed against the CMMC, the 110
Yes.
controls versus a cloud service that stores, processes, transmits CUI. Now, if it's in the
Hmm.
cloud, you need to meet FedRAMP or FedRAMP moderate equivalent, which is the path PreVeil took and was recently approved and certified by the DoD to have met FedRAMP moderate equivalency. So maybe that's where that question, was also kind of leaning.
And what's interesting about so I what to piggyback off what you mentioned. So CUI assets and security protection assets, both of those asset categories are assessed against 100 and the full 110 controls according to CMMC. That does contradict a little bit about what the Sentar team has seen in JSVs. They tend to focus currently on CUI assets. Of course, security protection assets are still coming up. Um, in short, I would say that JSVs are a very helpful process because at this point they're a lot easier to achieve. And the CMMC final rule hasn't been fully established yet. So it's not necessarily on paper that those security protection assets have to be assessed against the full 110 controls.
That's a great point, and I'm glad you mentioned that because some people are questioning if there's value in the JSV process, but I think you brought up a good point in that I have heard it's a bit more lenient than what the expected full CMMC rule will bring. So to each their own on that. I think that answers the questions we had specific to scoping. We have time for just a few more questions. Since you brought it up, and it's everyone's favorite topic, it seems. But we did have a question: how do you make sure your FIPS solution stays validated? And I assume that they're referring to the FIPS validated module. How do you make sure that that stays relevant? I know that for ourselves, we have a FIPS validated module, and it expires sometime in 2026 is when we'll have to renew. And all of that information can be found through the CMVP website I apologize, I don't have the exact link. But that's certainly one way, right? You can actually go and look to make sure that the NIST module is still current. They'll also list if a module is expired or if it's historical. And I think you had some other thoughts around this, making sure things are enabled properly. Maybe if you want to dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So the CMVP database that stands for Cryptographic Module Validated Process, I believe. Basically, it's this database where all of the FIPS validated uh, modules are listed. It's a NIST website. We, as a C3PAO, we utilize that database quite heavily when we're working with clients for gap assessments and during JSVs. So I would recommend that if you're concerned about FIPS, that you do. Oh, Jamie just dropped a link. That's great. Do some research on the modules that you have utilized within your environment. I would do some digging on some vendor documentation. But those FIPS certificate numbers, those will come up in a JSV. We are interested in those. We're very interested in those, fortunately and unfortunately. Um, but yeah, I know to avoid going into technical specifics for the CMVP database, so not only do you have to have your FIPS validated module in place, but you also have to have it that module be on a tested configuration. All that information is on the CMVP website. It has caveats as well, including, for instance, you may need to be to optimize that module to be utilizing it correctly, you may need to be operating in FIPS mode. A lot of people don't know that, but those caveats are associated with those modules on the CMVP database.
Yeah, that's great. And I have heard the FIPS enabled thing come up from time to time. We actually took the approach to make it easier for our customers that we just enable FIPS by default. And in fact, you can't turn FIPS mode off. So, because we were taking a very pro FIPS approach to getting validated, we felt that would be easiest, and that way it wouldn't potentially break anything. But I think that is an important call out, because I know with a lot of FIPS modules, you do have to be running in FIPS mode or have FIPS enabled. And I understand that assessors will potentially look for that to validate that it's configured properly, is what I've heard. So here's a great question for you, Hayden. How do you qualify for a JSVA? Is it wide open to any company with an active contract? What are the requirements to qualify?
So, Kyle, to qualify for JSVA, you have to, so from what I understand, your organization has to have at least one valid cage code. So that cage code is going to be that cage code will need to be provided during the application process. But Kyle, any interested parties will need to reach out to a authorized C3PAO. Sentar is one of them. We've worked with Redspin as well. They're great to work with. So you'll reach out directly to a C3PAO, tell them you're interested in doing a JSVA, and then you'll work together on a quote to ensure that the C3PAO gets paid. And then from there, the C3PAO would go to DIBCAC. They'll submit the application on your behalf. And then from that point, all of that is fair game, pretty much, to any company that has a valid cage code. They can, at that point, DIBCAC and the C3PAO and the company, they'll hop on a kickoff call, and they'll basically ask some preliminary screening questions to ensure that the company is ready for a JSVA. And at this time, I believe the only screening requirement at that point is to have a complete and up-to-date SSP. The SSP does not have to be the most glamorous, well-written thing in the world. I could say that we've seen some SSPs that definitely need work, but DIBCAC and the C3PAO are mainly there just to confirm that you have that SSP in place and that you have that boundary diagram completed as well. As part of that, that you know where your CUI is and can speak to it effectively during your JSV. And lastly, Kyle, I believe at this point, the timelines may have changed, but they have quite a bit of backlog. DIBCAC does, but I believe the earliest openings are in October. But of course, if you're interested in getting assessed before then, they may be able to fit you in if they have like spontaneous openings, because sometimes they do.
Hayden, thanks for that information. And is there any requirement to have a self-assessment score entered into SPRS?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
Yeah, so when Sentar assists with CMMC gap assessments, we'll work with them. We'll provide them with a security assessment report, which includes that SPUR score. But then that SPUR score holds the same weight as a self-assessment SPUR score. But no, it's not a requirement. I think at this point, to piggyback on what you said. We talked about how there's some deliberation regarding the value of JSV. So not only are the requirements, so the requirements regarding security protection assets are less rigorous at this time. So there is a regarding POAM items. So during a JSV, POAM items are generally like accepted. Even the 3-pointers and the 5-pointers, because each control is assigned a certain point value ranging from 1 to 5. At this point, you could pretty much POAM most anything, as long as DIPCAC and the C3PAO don't agree that there are any large technical showstoppers. And those technical showstoppers might include some of the violations of the CUI flow creep that we talked about. As long as you don't have those, you could pretty much POAM anything. And as long as you get POAM successfully remediate those actions within 180 days, the C3PAO and DIPCAC will verify that you have remediated those. Your score could be really quite good. And so yes, JSVA is very good. I would recommend anyone go through it at this time because it's just so much easier. And I think companies don't necessarily recognize that because they view it as this very nerve-wracking thing. But when the formal rule is announced, those 3 and 5-pointers, they're not going to be permitted. At least that's what the proposed rule says. So, and then lastly, once the JSV is done, say a company gets a 110 following, say that they had POAM'd items, they remediate everything, they get a 110. That 110 is valid. I believe it's at least 3 years after the formal rule hits. So that could be 2028, 2029. And
I
that's,
think they actually
yeah,
changed that in the most recent formal rule where it's good for
really.
3 years from the assessment, from the completion
Oh,
of the assessment
goodness.
date.
Okay.
They did
Thank you,
change that,
Jamie.
yeah.
I didn't know
Yeah.
that. Well,
In
that bums
fact, the
me out.
Cyber AV brought that up on the last town hall. They're lobbying to make it 4 years
Okay.
because they felt that the 3 was
Gotcha.
not fair. But
I
yeah,
still think
that
it's good.
did change.
Still good. That's
Yep.
3 or 4 years from
Yep.
now.
And it gives you a head start on all of your competition. You know, you can say that we've been assessed and certified essentially. So great. I think we got time for just one last question. I'll answer this one. Orly, if you could put up the contact info slide. I know some people probably have to be leaving here shortly. That would be appreciated. And the last question was, is it better to become compliant through a third party or in-house? I think it's probably more fair for me to take this one since you have a little bit of a bias here, Hayden. But what we, always tell folks is that, do what you can from a self-assessment standpoint. If you're only level 1, you'll never be required to become compliant through a third party. And that's for folks that don't handle controlled unclassified information. If you're strictly handling federal contract information, FCI level 1, you can self-assess there. At level 2, there's a small percentage of folks that will be able to self-assess at level 2, undetermined yet, and it's going to be, in the neighborhood of about 5% of folks. So I would not expect that you will fall under the self-assessment capabilities for level 2. And in that case, it comes down to, do you work with a third party or do you try and do it in-house? Typically what I've seen is organizations will do their self-assessment, get their SPRS score in, but then they'll want to work with a third party that has the specialty, has the training and the knowledge to do this. And I always recommend, just go ahead and work with a C3PAO at this point, even if it's just for a gap assessment, even if you're not ready for a JSV and you're not ready to go for the full assessment, bring somebody in, that does this and are professional at this, because they're going to give you the information that you need to hear. Not necessarily what you may want to hear, but they're going to give you the information that's going to help you then get on a path to success. And you can use, a C3PAO for gap assessment. Use the same one for your full assessment as long as they're not providing you any consulting. So as long as you don't blur that line of consulting versus assessing, you can work with the same company, and that will typically, help reduce the effort the second time around as well, because they've just got to go and validate, what they've already looked at. Um, Anything to add there, Hayden?
No, I did want to say, I think Kyle had another question on FIPS. Kyle, I'll work with Orly and Jamie. I'll see if I can get your email and I'll send over a response to you when I get a moment. But
Great.
thank
I
you very much for your
appreciate that.
time, Jamie,
Yeah.
Orly.
So
Appreciated
so
the
we're
conversation.
wrapping up. As our guest this month, Hayden, it is you get to pick the winner. So every month we do a $25 Starbucks gift card to the best question. I'll just again reiterate who the questions were. You can pick which one you chose. You don't have access to who all these people are, so you don't have any bias. So the first question was, how do you verify assets being in scope versus out of scope as far as storing, processing, transmitting CUI? We had a question around, how does the CUI boundary extend to subcontractors? At what point do they become part of their own scope? We had a question about, can you briefly process CUI in an asset and then kind of turn it off to get it out of scope, which you can't really do. We had a question about the scope for a SIM, got into a little conversation around security protection assets, and then a question about JSVAs, as well as how do you become the best path to becoming compliant. So out of those, Hayden, pick which one was your favorite. No
I
pressure.
liked the one on subcontracting. That's just so interesting to me, the
Great.
subcontracting issue. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, really appreciate your time this month, Hayden, and hopefully everyone that joined us got something valuable out of the call. Look forward to seeing you, next month for the next session of Coffee and Compliance. We should have that on our webinar here in about a week or so.
Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.